All right. Well, today I'm joined by my friend, Hadar Hazony, who's actually an ISI Weaver Fellow and who's working on his PhD, focusing on German idealism at the University of Notre Dame. Thanks for joining, Hadar.
Thanks for having me.
So you were just giving a talk to the ISI staff talking about national conservatism and, there are various divisions among national conservatism, but there's a core kind of that holds people together. And for that core, you're actually talking about, Western civilization, particularly great books, because a lot of the people who go to the conference, they're bookworms, they love ideas. And so you made this interesting remark about how the Western canon goes from the first, opening sentence of Genesis 1:1 all the way to Nietzsche's, was it Nietzsche's Antichrist?
Indeed.
Okay, so why did you choose to stop the Western canon with Nietzsche?
Well, let's start with why did I choose to start the Western canon? You start the Western canon with Genesis because historically, that has been the book, or obviously the entire Bible, but starting with Genesis, the book which was the ABCs for every child up to every scholar, basically in every single culture and country that we associate with the West for thousands of years. Obviously, there are other very, very important books, and I noted Plato as another major pillar, but the Bible was the ABCs, both for children and for scholars, from the youngest until the most old and most wise. So it's a natural place to begin. Of course, there are important things prior to the Bible, but their influence, at least their direct influence, is not so apparent and not so actual. So why end with Nietzsche? Well, one way to say it is there has not been a philosopher of that stature since Nietzsche. So it simply is the last time there was a truly great philosopher. That's one way to say it, but maybe I'm biased. So let's not say that. Let's say something else. Nietzsche understood, and he was not the only one, but he was definitely one of the early ones, that Western civilization was running out of steam, that the propulsion, the forward movement, both in science, technology, and the arts, but most importantly in morality and social fiber, right? The health of the communities and the nations was waning. And it was almost as if the spirit that animated it was evaporating. And what was left was this kind of husk that was tumbling forward with no real understanding of where it was going. And he basically prophesized the fall of Europe. He saw it coming. He saw the wars coming, but more importantly, he foresaw the empty cathedrals. I mean, it's straight out of the parable of the madman. It's just right there on the page. You read it. If you go to Rome, you go to Europe, you go to Germany, there are these beautiful cathedrals. And you walk in and you say, wow, what kind of people lived here that they built these things? Like, they must have been giants of the spirit and technical ability and artistic talent. And they're empty. They're like full of tourists. Like, you're walking around looking up at it like, oh, that's very interesting. And then you realize people used to worship here. This used to be a center of a living spirit, and that spirit is gone. Now, of course, there are still believers in Europe. I'm not, it's a slight exaggeration, but only an exaggeration. It is not false. It is correct that the spirit has decayed and died in Europe. And I believe that it is significantly more alive in America, and America is still young and vibrant, and I write about that. But those same sighs of old age can be heard on this side of the Atlantic as well. And Nietzsche was the one who first, most powerfully and most presciently said, I can see the end coming. Sure. And he attempted to orchestrate a rebirth, to orchestrate a reconstruction. And this is a common misconception, that people think that Nietzsche was jettisoning the Western culture, Western tradition. People think that Nietzsche was trying to revert back to before Plato or back to before the Bible. And this is just a mistake. It's a misreading of Nietzsche. What he's looking for is a rebirth, a new childhood. And a rebirth means an emergence from, right? A coming from Christianity, a coming from Western tradition and Greek philosophy, a reworking and reshaping and employing the great artifacts that we have into something that is young and vibrant and energetic. But that does not and I say very explicitly, does not involve an entire jettisoning of the past. And okay, the mistake is fair because he speaks very, very critically and very aggressively, and his rhetoric is flowery and at times violent. And so people assume from that means that he has no value for Christianity, or no value for Greek philosophy, or no value for the Bible. Excuse me. And so therefore what we must do is start anew from the very beginning. Start anew does not mean start anew from the very beginning. It means rise as a phoenix from the ashes. And this is not totally original to Nietzsche, because Hegel is already writing about this, about how truth, once it becomes stultified, it becomes fossilized, it must go through this process of death and rebirth, and emerge like a phoenix from the ashes. And that's what Nietzsche is doing. That is his project. Now, we can discuss whether he was successful or unsuccessful, but he was the first and last, right? He was the one who was still in the very heart of the movement of Western civilization, when it was still vibrant and alive, but at its kind of death coil at the end, and noticed, realized before others that the end is coming, and tried to orchestrate a return and a rebirth. And in that sense, since no one has achieved it since him, perhaps he didn't achieve it either, but no one else has. So until somebody does what it was that Nietzsche said was necessary, then Western civilization cannot get to the next level or attain its next stage. And so that's why I say, from the first word of Genesis to the last word of the Antichrist.
And for Nietzsche, who you know much better than I do, what would be the kind of the philosophical foundation or civilizational underpinnings of a world, if he was successful in building the world he wanted to, what would that look like today?
So an oft misunderstood passage in Nietzsche is the master-slave dichotomy, or I should say the master-slave morality, which is a reframing of the Hegelian master-slave dichotomy, which in itself is a rephrasing and reframing of Aristotle's master and slave relationships.
Okay.
Right? So this is very much, so you look at the master-slave morality and people say, oh, this is a rejection of the Western tradition. No, it's in the Western tradition. It's from Aristotle to Hegel, and then it's in Nietzsche. So like we're in the tradition. The tradition is the conversation, right? We have not exited the conversation. And yet there's an important addition, right? So for Hegel, well, let's start with Aristotle. For Aristotle, the master reflects the logos, the mind, right? Whereas for the slave is the technical ability and the body. And it is good and just, it is correct that which is higher, the mind, guide the body, and that the body do as it is told by the mind, and that is supposed to be for the benefit of both the body and the mind. And so it is just when superiors command inferiors so that both can flourish. Hegel flips this on its head, and he says, well, if the master is telling you what to do, and you as a slave, or we should say as a subordinate, because we don't believe in the institution of slavery, and nor did Hegel, but he's using it as a type, right? So the subordinate, if the subordinate obeys the superior, right, he actually is demonstrating self-mastery, because he's not doing what he wants. He's doing what he's told. He's controlling himself. And the master, or the superior who commands, actually is not master of himself, because he's just doing what he wants. He says, bring me that book over there, because I want it. And then the book comes to him, and he has exercised no self-mastery. So there's a kind of educative process whereby obedience develops the ability of self-rule. And for Hegel, it was necessary historically that human beings go through this process, that it was necessary that in earlier times we had more tyrannical governments, and that over time humanity learned how to govern itself so that citizens and individuals could be free because they could govern themselves, they could control themselves. And eventually the ruling class, the kings, could in some sense be done away with. We wouldn't need them. Now, not exactly, because Hegel technically believed in a constitutional monarchy, but basically that freedom, self-governance was something that had to be taught. It was not something that occurs naturally. And in this sense, the Germans disagree with the English. Well, not with the English, but with the English that we read with Locke and Hobbes, with this idea that people are born free, right? So for the Germans, they say, well, no, freedom is something that we have learned over time. We have achieved. And for Hegel, especially, this happens through the perspective of the slaves, quote unquote, but really he's talking about Christianity. He's talking about self-control. He's talking about limiting your own desires. The Christian religion, following, obviously the demonstration of Jesus, who is kind of the archetype of total self-control in the sense that he completely sacrifices himself. There is no part of him that he is not in control of. And that probably, obviously for Hegel, that's insufficient. We have to go from spiritual self-control, control of our internal world, to then actually being self-governing in the real world. So the teachings of Christianity must be translated into political activity. But nevertheless, that process of Christianity was an elevation of human beings. It was an acquiring of new skills, of self-mastery. And it's kind of funny because really what he's saying is, you say that Christianity is the religion of the meek and the lowly, but really, in a spiritual way, it's actually the religion of the most noble, those who are in control of themselves, those who are not dominated by their desires, but can rule their desires. So then we come to Nietzsche. And so people come to this master-slave morality in Nietzsche, and they assume that, he says nasty things about the slave morality, and he says things that sound kind of good about the master morality. And therefore, Nietzsche believed that really we should all just do whatever we want. We should never obey anyone. We should reject, our parents, and we should reject our teachers, and we should reject our religion, and we shouldn't even obey the law, some people think. And it's all about like returning to some kind of Homeric hero, like each powerful man will at any given moment just do whatever he wants. And that's Nietzscheanism. And no, that is barbarism. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Like reverting to piracy was not Nietzsche's goal. Like his goal was to give birth to the next great stage of civilization. Civilization is not piracy. It's not tiny little groups of young men just completely running amok, acting on their most base instincts. It's the opposite of Nietzscheanism. It's almost ludicrous. Sorry, okay.
This is great.
Now I'm just, you've gotten me excited. That's the problem. I get, anyway, I just love Nietzsche too much. But so just to wrap up. So for Nietzsche, the slave morality also was the education of mankind. And this is very explicit. He says that it was the priests who made mankind interesting, that the priests created man's soul, right? That our internal psychology and our ability to think complicated thoughts, to be manifold in our intentions and practices, occurred through the restraining of the body. And Foucault gets this from Nietzsche, that the restraints that the traditional morality, traditional religion placed on human beings that redirected our base desires inwards to mine out and shape our internal spheres so that we can think complicated things and aspire to great complex things. And so for Nietzsche, he says, yes, it's true. He says that slave morality is a kind of disease, but he also says that Socrates was diseased. And, newsflash, he also says of himself that he is of the diseased type, right? So if it's so bad, why is he calling himself that, right?
Fascinating.
So no, really, there is something very good about it, that it has stored up and gathered an immense amount of force and power. Platonism and Christianity, which at times Nietzsche kind of conflates, have for thousands of years built up the spiritual stores of mankind. And for Nietzsche, it is time to let those stores out, to let that immense built-up energy burst forward in a new way of being.
So I'm wondering, for a couple of reasons, what the connection is between Nietzsche and Machiavelli. What just stands out to me just hearing you talk about Nietzsche is kind of how you said, he's misunderstood. He's not jettisoning the entire kind of Western tradition. Similarly with Machiavelli, there is, one reading of him is that he is a complete severing from everything that came before him, Christian or classical, and that he's totally, untethering politics from anything above it, right? But this past year, I've been working on this book project and, reading a lot of classical sources, particularly Xenophon's, Cyrus, also reading ancient Indian texts, ancient Chinese texts on kind of political statecraft, and the similarities between them and Machiavelli are striking. So much, I don't want to overstate it because I'm sure there are nuances, but I think you could say that Cyrus the Great was Machiavellian in a very real sense. And so to me, I read it and I felt like, oh wow, there's actually a lot of continuity from this classical past. So what's the relationship between Nietzsche and Machiavelli, and do you have any comments on Machiavelli himself and his relation to the Western tradition?
Well, first, Machiavelli is wonderful, right? So that's the first comment. That's always the first comment. He's just wonderful. I agree with you. I think that the view of the total jettisoning of the past is overstated, and it's overstated in some intellectual traditions for the sake of a certain kind of rhetoric. There's a certain narrative that wants to be taught, and sometimes that narrative wants to say the past is bad, and we're totally free of that. Oh, we're not primitive religious believers. We have no connection to the Greeks. We that's all behind us. We're past that now. We don't, and then obviously, and because it's past, we don't need to read the Bible. We don't need to know what Jeremiah said. Oh, Aristotle, he's just some dusty old fellow, who cares? So that's one kind of narrative. There's a different narrative that wants to say, actually, the past was good, and everything we have now is bad. Nothing good has been done since the year 1450, or choose as you will. Some people say 1800, and some people say 1600, whatever. There's this narrative that goes, there was the moment that it all went wrong, right? And so, so obviously Catholics want to say that it's Luther, and Protestants want to say it was the French Revolution. And then you'll have like these, Homeric people who want to say, no, really, it was Socrates who was the source of the problem. No, really, it was the Old Testament. There's all kinds of these kind of views that
conservatives' favorite game is where did civilization go off?
Yeah, exactly. I find it to be, it's amusing academically, but
sure.
I don't think it has too much value in truth, in reality. People always, Nietzsche has a great aphorism where he says, always in my own world, all that I see around me, I draw from. Things that are not near me, I see not. Right? So any thinker, no matter how revolutionary, creative, genius, towering as he is, did not create his thoughts ex nihilo. There are no such thinkers. And if you believe in such thinkers, you're being sold a bill of goods. Somebody is pulling a fast one on you. Now, maybe it's because they don't know the sources. That's all too common. But it's not true. So for Nietzsche, I've already said, he draws on obviously on Plato immensely, on the Greeks, on the pre-Socratics, on the New Testament extensively, on Indian sacred texts, on Buddhist sacred texts. But the relationship with Machiavelli is not just that they are both very creative at reworking previous things. There is a deeper relationship, which is the critique of morality, which Nietzsche is probably the greatest of the critics of morality. But Machiavelli already begins this question, this important question, where if theology and politics are not the same, right? That there is this one question about what is the objective good and true. And there's another question of how do you make things happen in the world? And politics is the art of making things happen in the world. And theology is the art of figuring out what is objectively true and good. And if you're good at theology, that doesn't mean that you're good in politics. And actually, Machiavelli says, if you're too obsessed with theology, it'll make you bad at politics. There's a certain sense in which you need to know when to let go. You need to know when to give in. You need to know when not to demand your entire worldview be accepted, but rather narrow what it is that you're looking to achieve. Pursue the achievable. Try to convince people of what they can be convinced of, not of the entirety of your, I am now going to cite you every single philosopher from the past 2,500 years, and I want you to accept everything they say, because that doesn't work. So for Machiavelli, he starts playing with this idea that perhaps there is a diverging of moralities. That in the everyday life of the normal human being, Christianity is an effective and important moral system, moral code. It's necessary. And people say he didn't believe in morality. I don't think that's true. I don't think it holds up. Even in The Prince, some people say, well, the Prince doesn't believe in morality, but the Discourses does. I don't think that's correct. It seems to me that he's saying, well, yes, there is this everyday morality. But when you're practicing the art of governance, you're trying to do things which cannot necessarily be done within the bounds of that traditional morality. So what is the morality that governs the governors? If it is not identical to your every, and I mean, I think we all naturally believe this, right? So if I were to tell you, I'm going to come to ISI tomorrow and give a lecture and I don't show up, you would be offended. I mean, why don't you call? Why don't you let me know you're not coming? You stood me up. What's wrong with you? You're a jerk. If a politician says, I'm going to be at this convention, and then all of a sudden he doesn't show up, you say, oh, well, there was an emergency.
Yeah,
he was doing something.
Far busier than I am, and something came up.
So the expectations, the social norms, right,
are different.
The customs are different. And for me, as a citizen, I do not have authority to decide that people should die. But people who rule governments, they decide when we go to war and when we don't go to war. And when they make decisions about people dying, people die. And there is a morality governing that. We don't want people being killed for no reason. But they make kinds of choices that I, as a citizen, do not make. So there's a divergence. And obviously, for Nietzsche, this divergence becomes not only important, but it becomes central. That different ways of being in the world are governed by different sets of rules, different sets of moralities. And the higher, let's say something provisional, there are higher and lower levels of being in the world. Higher and lower are distinguished by their complexity and organization. So for Nietzsche, somebody becomes high or becomes great if he has the ability to unite many principles in one theory, conflicting principles. It is exactly the ability to handle diversity which makes something great. To be diverse and yet coherent. That is something's greatness, to have a style. A person who has a style is not somebody monotonous. It's somebody who can have all kinds of variations in what they say and what they do and how they look in all forms of art, but that those variations are understood by the person perceiving them as coming together in a constellation, right? And that is what makes something big or great or high, or we would say noble, right? So a child has a very limited ability to weigh between conflicting principles. Don't steal is just about all they can handle. They can't think beyond that too, but if you're going to save a starving person, it may be actually just to steal. So that adding that additional principle of we must preserve life and balancing it against do not steal, that's a higher order level than just don't steal, right? And the more principles you add, the higher you ascend in what we would call the hierarchy of nobility or of virtue. And the highest levels are not comprehensible to the lowest levels. So children see their parents do things that they are forbidden to do, and they don't understand why. They say it's unjust. You're staying up past 10 o'clock. Why can't I stay up past 10 o'clock, right? But, the father knows because I have a deadline and there's work tomorrow. Yeah, I'm going to be tired and it's going to be bad. So there is a little glint of immorality there. There is a repercussion. The rule, don't go to sleep after 10 o'clock, still applies, but there is another rule applying here additionally, which is you got to get in your stuff to your boss by the deadline or it's going to be a problem. And the child is not capable of understanding that. And as you ascend the hierarchy of value, you attain levels of complexity that are not understood by people at the lowest levels. And so, in Nietzsche's opinion, of course. And so for Nietzsche, that means that actually, in reality, the activity of the highest spheres is seen as immoral by the activity in the lowest spheres. And it is not. It is just a different morality. It is a complex morality. And it is completely wrong to say that Nietzsche believed that we shouldn't be moral. It's not true. He explicitly says, I mean, it's one of these things that cracks you up because you think to yourself, they haven't read the books. They just have not read the books. He says this in Daybreak, very, very, it's ink on paper. There are those, I'm not quoting directly, but essentially what he says is, there are those who will say that I am telling people to act immorally against the actions of morality. And in fact, many of the things that are considered moral, I want people to continue to do. And many of the things that people consider immoral, I think ought to be discouraged and people should not do them. But I want them to be done for no reasons that have not yet been understood, right? And in that sense, he is following in the steps of Christ, who says, I have come, right, not to abolish not one jot or tittle of the law. Yet the spirit of the law must be understood in a new way. And for Nietzsche, I mean, he's clearly doing it. As an aside, in Nietzsche's telling of the history of mankind, there is one pivotal point where there is a transvaluation of values. And it's obviously the crucifixion. That's the moment where the values are inverted. And when he wants to encapsulate what is his goal, his singular goal, he says that sentence, transvaluation of all values. So an understanding that there is a higher law, not that our lower law is wrong, but that there are higher laws and that we must attain them and we must contextualize the different principles in different laws, particularly because of the coming together of moralities from all over the globe and traditions from all kinds of human societies, that there needs to be a new principle which encompasses all of them. And I believe that he is building on Machiavelli in just another way in which, he is not rejecting the tradition, but building on the tradition. That this distinction of the morality of the low and the morality of the high, it's very, very clear and convincing in Machiavelli, but it is fleshed out and it significantly more worked out, built up in Nietzsche.
Okay, so I want to pit one last question, which I think maps onto what we were just talking about, but it might diverge. So this is getting more to the topic of nations, right? And this the relationship between particulars and universals. And one thing that I've been curious about is what does within a kind of a nationalist framework, what is the role of universals? What, if anything, is above the nation state, either both in terms of morality, right? But also in terms of, I mean, I guess in your own context, if you're Jewish, right? Yeah. And you have a very clear sense of the particulars and the laws that God gave, that apply to your place, to your people in that location. But you also believe that, that God spoke the world into existence, right? And that there is one God, right? And there are other nations, in India, for example, who we have friendly coalition relationships with, who believe in many gods, right? And so what is the, what does that relationship between particulars and universals look like when it comes to nation state?
Yeah, well, let's just say something about Nietzsche, just so there's no confusion. I mean, Nietzsche was not a nationalist. He was a explicit anti-nationalist, and he basically thought that nationalism was primitive and liberal. Primitive and liberal, and he was opposed to it. So
he was in favor of what in its place?
A united European culture.
Okay.
Yeah. He's not always clear about the exact political constitution. There's just a difference between Germans and Americans.
Sure.
Right. The Germans like the spirit.
Yeah.
They like the spanning theological, philosophical, metaphysical, great statements. And the English, but particularly the Americans, which are sometimes mistaken for not having very powerful and deep ideas, which is completely false. They like to put them in very precise and concrete terms. So it's just a divergence, at least the early Americans. It's obviously today it's a bit different. So Nietzsche was not a nationalist. But, how would I go about thinking about this question of particulars and universals? It seems to me that every person who believes that they have attained the universal truth is ultimately proved to be mistaken.
Yeah.
That's been my experience. Even the best and the brightest, the most convincing. I mean, Hegel is a great example of this. I mean, possibly the greatest philosopher of modernity, and it's been a couple hundred years, and there are questions. There are certain questions about how exactly right was he, and I believe that's true of any great philosopher, any great thinker. So, I in general, I don't want to say there are no universal truths, because how could you prove such a thing? Right? Create an experiment which proves that there are no universal truths. But the human ability to attain universal truths, that has been fairly demonstrated to be, at the very least, we should be cautious about it. At the very least, we should be somewhat skeptical when a man comes down the mountain and says, I have attained the one and only forever and ever. We have a few questions. So does that mean we despair and say every man for himself and everyone does what they want? Well, we know that doesn't work. That's been tried. Well, we've tried paganism. We tried it for a couple thousand years. I mean, it's barbaric and it leads to all kinds of things that, I mean, in the most simple sense, can destabilize society and destroy human relations with each other. We have to have some basis of interaction, which is a basis for mutual intercourse. And that's true between nations just as it is between individuals. I mean, so it's insufficient to say, well, okay, there will be agreement within the nation, but the different nations each will have a radically different, completely nothing shared. That too is insufficient. So we build up. We look at the entirety of human experience, and we say, look, these may not be eternal. These may need to be adjusted in the future. But what is held good and true, from the first plow that was hammered and the first field that was sown up until yesterday, when a farmer took his tractor and went out and plowed the field. Which patterns, habits, practices, beliefs, institutions, morals, which brought prosperity and which brought corruption, which brought benevolency and peacemaking between man, and which destroyed civilizations and ended great traditions. And I don't think that this is a completely unanswerable question, right? There are some basic things that appear, if you look across history, to seem to cohere. For example, societies need laws. A lawless society, perhaps it is in the very short term good for very few individuals, but I don't think so. I don't even think that's the case. But let's say that in the extremely short term, it's good for an extremely small number of individuals. But it's in the long term good for no individuals, and in the medium term, bad for most individuals. So let's not do that, right? And I'm not claiming that I can prove, up to the hilt and with finality, that for the rest of history, until God Himself comes down, that having laws in your society is the best system. I just know that there's nothing else that's worked, and basically this has always worked. So, you'd have to be a madman to not do that. And I think that there are a set of these basic principles that emerge through time. And so some people want to call them natural law. And some people would like to say these truths can be rationally deduced from the very structure and fabric of nature, and I can prove that these are the only principles. I'm just not. I'm more humble than that. I don't think we can prove that. I don't think the human mind, and especially the rational faculties, which, as Nietzsche says, are a late comer in the general constellation of our abilities, can achieve that. I don't think that the rational capacities of man can encompass the mind of God, and I don't even think Thomas Aquinas believed that. But I'll leave that to people who know more than me to argue about. So let's say something more modest. Let's say something like, we know that although, yes, different countries are going to do things differently, and different nations have different traditions, and they're going to have different practices, we know that there are minimal practices that if you don't adhere to them, there is no way for us to make your world work. It's going to devolve into chaos as far as we can understand. And so if we are going to have mutual relations of peace, of trade, of interaction, of military alliance, we need you to adhere to these minimal principles. I don't necessarily believe that we ought to raise armies and go forth and enforce these, laws on other people. But if you're going to be in friendly relations with us, we just need this because
some shared, an operating system. There has to be some basis.
Some basic principles. And with good reason. This is not some relativistic, simple assertion of self, like, be like me or I won't talk to you. No, it's just, look, human history is not that long. It's 10,000 years, okay? Mm-hmm. We have, whatever came before, it's not like we have now. So we look at those 10,000 years and we have to make prudential decisions about what works and what doesn't work. And we work from there. And so within that broad sphere of agreement, I think there's an immense room for differentiation. So, England has a king and America has a president, and in Israel, the president is a figurehead, and really there's a prime minister, and there's divergence. There's great divergence, and it's true also of religious custom, and it's true of artistic custom. But it's not clear to me that the divergence is so great that we cannot say anything about what has been demonstrated to be effective, as in lead to flourishing, and beautiful, as in lead to the elevation and cultivation of man, and good in the sense that it gives mankind a sense that they are going somewhere, that they are part of something, that they are elevating the entire world towards something higher, and I would say towards God. And I think that is accessible. I think that's accessible. I want to be humble about it. I don't think that we should be arrogant about our beliefs. We shouldn't belittle other people's beliefs. But I think in humility, there is much room for agreement.
On that note, we'll wrap up. Hadar, if people want to follow your work, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter, h.a.hazony. That's usually where I'm lurking about. My email is public, so if you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. And I sometimes occasionally write for First Things or places like that, but it goes on the Twitter, so that's where you should look for it.
All right. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.